So I was reading the story of how Peter walked on the water, and this time around I read it and I got a new revelation of it. In verse 23, we know that Jesus went alone to pray, and in the midst of him praying, you have Peter and the other disciples traveling on the water to the other side. One of the things that God showed me is that God is persistent to cover us before going out, and he is faithful to show up in the midst. Verse 23, Jesus understood the importance of spending time with God alone in prayer for two reasons. For one, for the further development of his relationship with God, and also the building of his faith. And number two, to be able to cover us and advocate for us, to equip us for life's challenges and struggles. Jesus already knew they were getting ready to head into a storm. He knew that they were going to be shaken in faith. When I read it, it was like Jesus knew to go to God in prayer, not only for himself, but for us, because he already knew what they were getting ready to come into. And he already knew that Peter was going to be the one who was going to respond in faith to even request of him to walk on the water. When we react in faith, we are led to experience an unusual demonstration of God's power. Peter reacted in faith, but he began to sink because he took his eyes off of Jesus and focused more strongly on the strong winds and the high waters around him. He felt vulnerable against what he had no control over, which is interesting because he was the one to respond in faith and even ask Jesus if he can come on the water with him. Another revelation that I got is sometimes God's covering is when he puts us in position to see the errors in our faith. When we put more faith and focus onto what is coming up against us, we fail. When we put more faith and focus on God, we stand strong because of our established relationship with God. But here's another thing I was able to see. If our circumstances are coming up against us, we shouldn't be in relationship with it, but the one who can protect us from it. Whatever relationship is stronger will be the most sovereign in your life. God has the final say, but the result you focus on is the result from the relationship that is the strongest. Is your relationship with God stronger, or is your relationship with your circumstances stronger? Because he had enough faith to respond and ask Jesus if he can come out onto the water, and he came out on the water. But he began to sink when he focused on the circumstances that was happening around him, the water and the winds. Although he had relationship with God, he allowed his relationship with not being able to control things to rule more than his relationship and confidence in God. If we have an understanding that it is our circumstances that come up against us, don't put your faith more in your circumstances than the faith that you will have in God, who you are establishing a relationship with, because you're always going to come into the result of you failing when you think of it that way. If Peter would have kept his eyes on Jesus the whole time, he would have sank. He actually probably would have made it all the way to where Jesus was. But also too, like I said, sometimes God covering is when he puts us in situations where he has to show us the errors in our faith for further development. This wasn't a trick. Jesus knew what was going to happen, but it wasn't a trick. It was for Peter to be able to understand that when your eyes is on me, you can go further than when your eyes is on the circumstances around you. Because one thing that is true is that God is going to be persistent, y'all. He is going to be persistent to cover us before we even go out, but he's also going to be faithful to show up in the midst. Jesus was in the midst. He showed up in the midst of the storm. He even showed up in the midst of Peter sinking, because Peter obviously made it out of the sinking. So God is going to be persistent. If we seek out the result of what God can do, we don't even have to worry about the circumstances around us. Not to degrade our circumstances or even the feelings that we feel within the circumstances, because those things are naturally going to come. But when we are able to shift our focus back to God, because we have relationship with God, and separate ourselves away from the circumstances because we're not in relationship with circumstance, we will gain the results that we're looking for, that God has for us, because our focus is on him. He is always going to be persistent in covering us before we go and showing up in the midst. So once again, the question to ponder is your relationship with God stronger, or is your relationship with circumstances stronger?